The unspeakable acts committed by U.S. soldiers against the Vietcong are a grim chapter in the history of American military engagement. As young men were plunged into the dense, unfamiliar terrain of Vietnam, confronted with an elusive enemy and an environment fraught with danger, some found themselves crossing lines that war had blurred or erased. The war in Vietnam raged between the years of 1955 and 1975. A brutal war with anywhere between 2.5 to 3.5 million dead. It was marked by the immense brutality and inhumanity perpetrated by both sides of the conflict. Torture and ill treatment were common, massacres were prevalent, and the use of chemical weapons still scars the nation to this day. The harsh conditions of the war had an incredibly potent effect on the minds of those fighting it, creating beasts out of otherwise ordinary Vietnamese and American men. Much has been said of the atrocities committed against American prisoners by the North Vietnamese. But rarely does anyone ever mention the crimes committed against the communist Vietnamese fighters who found themselves imprisoned south of the demilitarized zone. Roughly 300,000 North Vietnamese and Vietcong soldiers ended up as prisoners of war, held captive by either the American military directly or the American-led South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN. The largest of the prisons, Coconut Tree Prison, held 40,000 Vietcong and North Vietnamese soldiers. The prison was surrounded by 15 layers of barbed wire and held some of the most senior communist soldiers and officials. Bad conditions and mistreatment were a part of life at this prison. Prisoners would be beaten, have their limbs broken, their teeth chiseled out with chisels, or even be suspended in the air with ropes for prolonged periods of time. Those thought to possess helpful information were sent to prisons such as Phu Quoc and Con San, where they would be interrogated and tortured. One common method of torture used by both the North and South Vietnamese was the use of tiger cages. These were small metal or bamboo cages, only just big enough to hold a human being. Placed out in the open, prisoners would be caged up in the blazing sun for hours, days, or even weeks, given just enough water to survive. They would be held until they were willing to speak, or just as they were nearing death. Phoenix Program. Special forces and intelligence gathering played a large part in the Vietnam War. The Phoenix Program, perhaps the most infamous intelligence operation, was intended to help identify and infiltrate the political infrastructure of the Vietcong in an attempt to destroy the command structure. The political infrastructure of the Vietcong included any Vietnamese civilians suspected of aiding the VC, whether by supplying them with food or hiding them from American forces. The program ran for 5 years between 1967 and 1972. And claimed to have resulted in the neutralization of 81,740 suspected members of the Vietcong. The program's number one objective was to gather intelligence on operatives and sympathizers within South Vietnam and then detain them. Captives believed to be in possession of valuable information were interrogated and tortured. The methods of torture varied, with the personal tastes of the men carrying it out. Sexual violence was common, with suspected Vietcong operatives being assaulted with clubs, bottles, and even snakes or eels. Electrocution was another favorite, nicknamed the Bell Telephone Hour. Inmates would have their tongues, genitals, nipples, or ears wired up to a car battery or crank telephone, both capable of giving strong electrical shocks. One intelligence officer, K. Barton Osborne, reported on his experiences with the program. He claimed to have witnessed Phoenix Program operatives hammering a 6-inch wooden dowel into the ear canal of a suspect, slowly tapping it further and further into the skull until the inmate's eventual death. Along with capturing suspects, the Phoenix Program also took part in assassinations. Over 20,000 people were killed under the orders of the program. Local informants, or already captured suspects, were used to locate these people who were on the blacklist, the list of those who were to be assassinated. According to Lieutenant Vincent Okamoto, American forces would bring their informant to the village, where they would then identify the house of the targeted individual. Whether this was truth or lie was almost impossible to prove. Still, American forces would follow by returning to the village at a later date, killing anyone within the marked property. When the realities of the Phoenix Program came to light back at home, intense public and political backlash resulted in the operation being shut down. Chemical warfare. The dense jungles and mangrove forests of Vietnam provided excellent cover for the guerrilla forces waging war against America and the ARVN. Vietcong cells could operate invisibly, able to engage American troops without ever being seen by their enemy. The American army was not at all suited for this type of warfare, so an attempt was made to turn the environment into a more favorable one. Agent Orange is a potent chemical herbicide produced by Monsanto and Dow Chemical, one of the so-called rainbow herbicides. It and others were used to destroy dense vegetation and woodlands in order to open up the landscapes and make it easier to locate and engage with North Vietnamese forces, and to destroy crops believed to be feeding them. The campaign was successful, with 80 million liters of Agent Orange destroying over 20,000 square kilometers of mangrove forests and thousands of square kilometers of rice and other crops, depriving the Vietcong of both food and concealment. This environmental destruction was severe, with many scientists believing there is no chance of the Vietnamese countryside ever fully recovering. Unfortunately, Agent Orange would have lasting effects not only on the Vietnamese countryside, but also on the Vietnamese people. Many people directly in contact with the chemical suffered increased risks of cancer. The Vietnamese Red Cross believes there are 3 million Vietnamese people suffering the effects of Agent Orange exposure, with many of these being children born to affected parents. The effects of children born to affected parents can be severe, ranging from mild physical disability to extreme mental and physical birth defects. Children born without eyes, with extreme bodily deformity, oversized heads, and neurodevelopmental disorders. Many of those affected cannot live without constant supervision and help, and will never be capable of holding a job, cooking a meal, or even writing their own name. Bombing campaigns. Laos, Cambodia. Laos and Cambodia, which both bordered Vietnam, were neutral during the conflict. However, the existence of strong communist forces in these two countries, the Khmer Rouge and Pathet Lao, meant they were used as supply lines for North Vietnamese forces. This meant that, despite their neutrality, both Cambodia and Laos came under heavy and sustained attacks from the United States, mainly in the way of a bombing campaign focused on destroying the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Operation Barrel Roll, Freedom Deal, and Menu were the three primary campaigns conducted against Cambodia and Laos by the United States. Hundreds of millions of bombs were dropped on the two neutral nations, with a plane load of bombs being dropped every 8 minutes between the years of 1964 and 1973. It is estimated that 30% of all ordnance dropped by American forces failed to detonate, meaning the Laotian and Cambodian countrysides are littered with millions of deadly explosives. The campaigns resulted in 250,000 to 350,000 deaths, over 400,000 wounded, and almost 1 million forced to flee their homes. Half a century since the war ended, American bombs are still a significant problem for the people of Cambodia and Laos. Over 20,000 Laotians alone have been killed since the end of the conflict, with many more permanently wounded and disabled, almost half of whom are children. The prevalence of unexploded ordnance, mainly comprised of small cluster bomblets, also has severe effects on economic development and progression. Many millions of acres of Cambodian and Laotian land are littered with explosives, making it impossible to construct buildings or farm crops, leaving many rural areas economically backward and stagnant. Free fire zones. American forces during the war in Vietnam established free fire zones. These were areas deemed to be populated only by enemy combatants, where any American weapons system could fire its weapons without the need for permission or confirmation. Anyone identified within these zones was assumed to be the enemy, and soldiers could shoot anything or anyone that moved without needing to confirm if it was a soldier or civilian. These zones became infamous for the carnage that occurred within them, with 1/3 of all enemy KIA within these zones believed to have been civilians and non-combatants. One of the most infamous instances of this was the My Lai massacre in 1968. Hundreds of men, women, and children were killed by soldiers of the 20th Infantry Regiment. There were many cases of extreme sexual violence, and children as young as 12 were sexually assaulted and mutilated. The American military establishment tried to cover up the incident. Still, it would soon come to public view, playing a large part in the growth of the anti-war movement back home in America. Soldiers were briefed on the eve of the attack. They were told that by the time they were to arrive in the village, all the Vietnamese civilians would be at the market, and that any remaining would be Vietcong or Vietcong sympathizers. The orders were to kill any suspects, pollute the village wells, destroy any crops, and burn the village to the ground. When asked, "Who is the enemy?" Captain Ernest Medina replied, They're all VC. Now go and get them. On the morning of the 16th of March, around 100 men, led by Captain Medina, landed in the small settlement of Sun Mi. The soldiers had expected to be engaged by Vietcong soldiers, but they met no resistance. They entered the village unchallenged and found mainly old men, women, and children. The killing started without warning when a Vietnamese civilian was pushed down a well, with a grenade thrown in after him. Then 15 or 20 people kneeling and praying at the temple were executed with point-blank shots to the head. The killings continued until around midday. Huts were set on fire and the occupants were shot as they escaped the blaze. People were gathered up into irrigation ditches, then massacred with machine guns and left out in the sun to rot. Survivors had grenades placed under them. Sexual violence also occurred, with at least 20 women between the ages of 10 and 45 being attacked, almost half of whom were under the age of 18. By the end of the day, 347 civilians had been killed by American forces. The Americans suffered only one casualty, a soldier who had intentionally shot himself in the foot to avoid having to participate in the massacre. After an attempted cover-up, 26 soldiers were charged with criminal offenses. Only one defendant, Lieutenant William Calley, would face any punishment. Initially sentenced to life imprisonment, President Nixon personally intervened and had his sentence commuted to just 3 years of house arrest. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.